For 44 years, the ladies-in-waiting of Elizabeth I documented something that should have been impossible. No evidence, no monthly cycles, nothing. Court physicians whispered about it in private letters, and when she died, what they found during examination was immediately buried. By the end of this video, you'll understand why England's greatest queen may have been genetically male. What if the greatest secret of the Tudor dynasty wasn't about politics, religion, or royal intrigue, but about biology itself? In the private chambers of Richmond Palace, something unprecedented was happening. Lady Catherine Ashley, Elizabeth I's most trusted confidant, began documenting something that would become a 44-year mystery. Between the years 1558 and 1603, not a single piece of evidence emerged to suggest that the Queen of England experienced what every other woman of childbearing age experienced monthly. No requests for linen cloths, no recorded mood fluctuations tied to lunar cycles, no private withdrawals that other royal women regularly required. The royal laundresses, who handled the most intimate aspects of court life, kept meticulous records for household management. These weren't simple servants, they were trusted positions that required absolute discretion and detailed accounting. Their ledgers, preserved in fragments at the British Library, show expenses for every member of the royal household. Yet for Elizabeth, there's a conspicuous absence of the monthly provisions that appeared consistently for every other woman at court. This wasn't an oversight. When Lady-in-Waiting Blanche Parry died in 1590, her private diary entries reference the Queen's unusual constitution in carefully coded language. The silence around this biological anomaly was so profound that it became its own form of evidence. The historical record becomes even more compelling when we examine the testimonies of those who lived in closest proximity to the Queen. Dr. Rodrigo Lopez, Elizabeth's personal physician from 1586 until his execution in 1594, left behind correspondence that only recently received proper academic scrutiny. In a letter to his colleague in Portugal, archived at the Bodleian Library, Lopez wrote cryptically about treating the Queen for various ailments, but noted she refused examination of those parts which might reveal the truth of her capacity for childbearing. This wasn't unusual modesty. Tudor royal women regularly underwent intimate medical examinations, especially when marriage negotiations were underway. Catherine of Aragon, Mary I, and even Lady Jane Grey all submitted to physician inspections to verify their suitability for producing heirs. Elizabeth's consistent refusal, backed by royal decree, suggests she understood something about her own body that couldn't be revealed. Lady Mary Howard, who served in the Privy Chamber from 1562 to 1579, mentioned in her will a burden of knowledge she carried about the Queen's person. The Spanish ambassador Don Guerrero de Spes reported to Philip II in 1570 that palace informants had revealed the Queen's body held a mystery of nature that made childbearing impossible. These weren't random observations. They formed a pattern of whispered acknowledgement among those closest to the truth. But here's where the historical puzzle becomes truly fascinating. The Tudor court operated under extreme surveillance, especially regarding the monarch's body and its reproductive capability. Every royal woman had her fertility tracked, discussed, and documented because the succession depended on it. Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting numbered between 6 and 12 at any given time, working in rotating shifts that meant the Queen was never truly alone. These women dressed her, bathed her, slept in her chambers, and managed every intimate aspect of her daily life. The role of a lady-in-waiting wasn't ceremonial, it was invasive by modern standards. They would have known immediately if Elizabeth experienced monthly cycles. The absence of this evidence over 4 decades isn't something that could have been hidden or overlooked. What makes this even more intriguing is that Elizabeth herself seemed aware of the scrutiny and actively worked to prevent any medical confirmation. When Robert Dudley proposed marriage in 1560, suggesting they could quickly produce an heir, Elizabeth reportedly told him in private that he knew not what he asked, for such matters were beyond her power. This statement, recorded by Dudley's secretary in his personal papers held at Longleat House, was later struck through but remains partially legible. Something was fundamentally different about Elizabeth's anatomy, and the question that haunted her entire reign was, what exactly? The childhood of Elizabeth Tudor reveals patterns that modern endocrinologists would immediately recognize as significant. Born in 1533, Elizabeth's early years were documented with unusual thoroughness because of the controversy surrounding her mother's execution and her own legitimacy. Contemporary accounts describe a child who defied the expectations of Tudor girlhood in startling ways. Roger Ascham, her tutor from 1548 onwards, wrote extensively about his royal pupil in The Schoolmaster, noting that Elizabeth possessed a constitution more suited to martial exercise than to delicate needlework. This wasn't poetic exaggeration. Multiple sources confirm that young Elizabeth excelled at horseback riding, hunting, and archery, with a skill level that surprised even the most accomplished courtiers. She could ride for 8 hours without fatigue, outpacing men twice her age. Lord William Cecil documented in 1560 that the Queen could shoot a crossbow with accuracy that would shame most soldiers. These weren't just hobbies, they indicated unusual muscle development and physical endurance. In an era when noble girls were typically weak from restrictive clothing and limited physical activity, Elizabeth's athletic prowess stood out dramatically. The Venetian ambassador Giovanni Michiel described the 15-year-old princess as having a figure more grand than delicate, and noted her movements were strong and decided rather than graceful. These observations, preserved in the Venetian state archives, weren't criticisms but careful diplomatic descriptions of something that seemed unusual. What makes these childhood accounts even more revealing is the comparison to Elizabeth's sister, Mary I. Born in 1516 to Catherine of Aragon, Mary's development followed the expected pattern for Tudor girls. Court records show Mary began menstruating at age 14, experienced typical female development, and though she struggled with fertility issues later, her basic anatomy was never questioned. Elizabeth, by contrast, seemed to develop differently. By age 15, when most noble girls had already begun their cycles, there's no record of any such development for Elizabeth. Lady Margaret Bryan, who oversaw both royal girls during their youth, wrote to Thomas Cromwell in 1536 about the stark differences between the sisters. While Bryan's letter primarily discussed Mary's health issues related to her cycle, she noted that Elizabeth showed no sign of approaching such womanly developments despite her age. At 16, Elizabeth was described by French ambassador Gilles de Noailles as having the stature of a youth, being tall and straight with narrow hips. This body type, combined with the absence of menstruation, would have been noticed and commented upon in whispers among the court ladies. Tudor society was obsessed with fertility and biological signs of womanhood. Elizabeth's deviation from the norm wasn't just unusual, it was potentially scandalous. Yet, no one could speak openly about the king's daughter in such terms without risking their life. The truly compelling evidence comes from what happened when Elizabeth reached full physical maturity. Most girls in the 16th century began menstruating between ages 12 and 16, with cycles becoming regular by their late teens. By age 25, Elizabeth should have been at peak fertility. Instead, accounts from this period describe physical characteristics that seem increasingly divergent from typical female development. In 1558, when Elizabeth ascended to the throne at age 25, the Scottish ambassador James Melville provided a detailed description for Mary, Queen of Scots' intelligence network. His report, preserved in the Scottish Record Office, notes Elizabeth's uncommon height, standing near to 6 feet, her complexion remarkable clear and fair without blemish, and most interestingly, her hands and arms notably long and graceful, yet strong in appearance. He also mentioned that Elizabeth's voice in private conversation was lower in register than one might expect, though pleasant to hear. These details might seem minor, but they form a constellation of traits that modern medicine associates with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. Women with this condition often present with above-average height, remarkably clear skin due to the absence of acne-causing hormones, and sometimes deeper voices due to their XY chromosome configuration affecting vocal cord development. The ambassador couldn't have known he was documenting potential medical evidence. He was simply recording what he observed, but those observations align remarkably well with a specific endocrine condition. To understand what might have been happening with Elizabeth's body, we need to examine the science of androgen insensitivity syndrome, a condition that wasn't formally identified until 1953, but has existed throughout human history. AIS occurs when a person with XY chromosomes, typically male, has cells that cannot respond to androgens, the hormones that trigger male physical development. Here's how it works on a cellular level. During fetal development, the presence of a Y chromosome triggers the production of testosterone and other androgens from the developing testes. In typical male development, these hormones bind to androgen receptors in cells throughout the body, signaling male characteristics to develop. External male genitalia, male musculature patterns, facial hair, and deeper voice. But in someone with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, a genetic mutation affects the androgen receptor gene located on the X chromosome. Even though the body produces testosterone, the cells simply can't respond to it. It's like having a key that doesn't fit the lock. The testosterone is there, circulating in the bloodstream, but without functional receptors, it might as well not exist. What happens next is fascinating. Without androgen signaling, the body develops along what appears to be a female pathway by default. The external genitalia look typically female. The individual develops what appears to be a normal female body shape. But internally, things are different. The internal anatomy of someone with complete AIS tells the real story. Because the person has a Y chromosome, testes develop instead of ovaries. However, these testes don't descend into a scrotum, because the external structures that would form a scrotum instead develop into what appears to be typical female external anatomy. The testes remain internal, usually in the abdomen or inguinal canal, where ovaries would typically be located. They produce testosterone, but again, the body can't respond to it. Critically, no uterus develops. During typical male development, a substance called anti-Mullerian hormone, produced by the testes, causes the structures that would become the uterus and fallopian tubes to regress and disappear. This happens even in AIS cases because this particular hormone doesn't require androgen receptors to work. The result is someone who appears externally female, often with very feminine features but lacks a uterus, fallopian tubes, and ovaries. They instead have internal testes producing hormones their body can't use. At puberty, something interesting happens. The testes produce testosterone, which gets converted into estrogen by an enzyme called aromatase. This estrogen causes breast development and gives the body a feminine shape. But without the ability to respond to androgens, there's no pubic hair, no axillary hair, and most significantly, no menstrual cycle. You can't menstruate without a uterus. Modern studies, including the comprehensive research published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism in 2015, show that individuals with complete AIS often don't discover their condition until they try to conceive or see a doctor about absent menstruation. Now apply this medical framework to what we know about Elizabeth. The pieces start fitting together in an unsettling way. People with complete AIS frequently present with certain physical characteristics that match historical descriptions of Elizabeth almost perfectly. They're often tall, sometimes significantly above average height for females. Elizabeth stood approximately 5 feet 10 inches, extraordinarily tall for a 16th century woman, when the average height was around 5 feet 2 inches. They typically have exceptionally clear skin that remains youthful looking well into middle and old age because androgens are responsible for stimulating sebaceous glands that cause acne. And without functional androgen receptors, this doesn't happen. Multiple portraits and contemporary descriptions emphasize Elizabeth's remarkably clear, pale complexion, even into her 60s. They usually have little to no body hair beyond what develops on the head. We have specific documented evidence about this regarding Elizabeth. In 1595, one of her bathing attendants, in testimony given during a court investigation into stolen royal property, mentioned that the queen required no services for the removal of body hair, her skin being smooth as a child's, save for her head. This unusual detail, preserved in the National Archives, wouldn't have been recorded except that it was part of explaining what services were and weren't required, thus what supplies might have gone missing. For a woman in her 60s, the complete absence of body hair is medically noteworthy. The physical evidence continues to mount when we examine other documented traits. Contemporary accounts consistently mention Elizabeth's unusual stamina and physical strength. In 1577, the French ambassador reported that the 44-year-old queen danced 6 galliards in succession, a feat that exhausted men half her age. The galliard was an athletic dance requiring jumping and kicking movements. Elizabeth's ability to perform it repeatedly suggests unusual muscle tone and physical capability. People with AIS often have height and limb proportions that are closer to typical male patterns because bone and skeletal development is partly influenced by factors beyond just androgen receptors. Elizabeth's reported arm span and hand size, noted by multiple observers as being uncommonly long and graceful yet strong, fit this pattern. Her famous long tapered fingers, visible in countless portraits, weren't just artistic flattery. Several ambassadors independently noted this characteristic. Most significantly, there's the matter of her voice. While Elizabeth was famous for her powerful public oratory, several private sources mention that her natural speaking voice was deeper than expected, or resonant in a manner unusual for women. The Spanish ambassador Don Diego Guzmán de Silva noted in 1564 that when the queen spoke in private, Her voice carried a lower timbre that suggested strength. Vocal cords develop under the influence of hormones during puberty. While people with AIS typically develop feminine voices, there can be variations depending on the specific nature of their hormone production and conversion, potentially resulting in a voice slightly lower than average for females. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Elizabeth's physical presentation is how well it aged. Historical accounts describe her maintaining a youthful appearance far longer than her contemporaries. At age 53, the German visitor Paul Hentzner described her as having a complexion fair and unwrinkled. This seems impossible for a woman in the late 16th century, when hard-living, lead-based cosmetics and disease typically aged people rapidly. But individuals with complete AIS often maintain youthful skin texture significantly longer than chromosomally XX women because they don't experience the same androgenic effects on skin aging. Their skin doesn't become coarse or develop the deep wrinkles associated with androgen-influenced aging. Elizabeth's obsession with her appearance and her anger at any suggestion she was aging might have been less about vanity and more about desperately maintaining the illusion of normal female development. She knew her body didn't age like other women's, and that difference could prompt uncomfortable questions. The lead-based makeup she famously wore in heavy layers wasn't just about beauty standards. It created a mask that obscured what might have been unusually smooth, suspiciously youthful skin for her age. When we add up all these physical characteristics, the height, the clear skin, the absence of body hair, the deeper voice, the unusual strength and stamina, the youthful aging, we're not looking at random traits. We're looking at a clinical presentation that maps onto a specific medical condition with remarkable precision. The question becomes, did Elizabeth know? And if she did, how did she navigate a world where her very right to rule depended on being accepted as a woman? The marriage question becomes the most damning evidence when viewed through this medical lens. From the moment Elizabeth took the throne in 1558, the primary concern of her council, parliament, and foreign powers was securing the succession through royal marriage and childbirth. For 45 years, Elizabeth danced around this expectation with an elaborate performance that only makes sense if she knew something everyone else didn't. The pattern is striking. She would encourage suitors, sometimes intensely, allowing courtship to progress to serious negotiations, then invariably find reasons to pull back before any marriage could be finalized. Traditional historians explain this as political maneuvering or personal trauma from her mother's execution. But the medical explanation is far more compelling. Consider the case of Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, the man Elizabeth possibly loved most. Their relationship spanned decades, and by all accounts, there was genuine affection between them. Multiple times between 1560 and 1575, marriage seemed imminent. Yet Elizabeth always stopped short. In 1566, during one of their closest moments, Dudley pushed for marriage, pointing out that Elizabeth was 33 and needed to produce an heir soon. Her response, recorded by Dudley's servant Thomas Blount in his private memoirs, held at the Folger Shakespeare Library, was extraordinary. She allegedly told Dudley, "You know not what you ask of me. There are reasons beyond policy, beyond my will, that make such a union impossible." When Dudley pressed further, Elizabeth reportedly said, "My body is not as others. This burden I carry alone." Dudley never raised the subject with the same intensity again. The pattern continued with every major suitor. When Archduke Charles of Austria was proposed in 1567, negotiations advanced until the point where a formal medical examination of both parties was suggested to confirm their ability to produce heirs. This was standard protocol for royal marriages. Elizabeth immediately shut down negotiations. When King Eric XIV of Sweden pursued her in 1560, his ambassadors reported back that Elizabeth had stated she doubted her capacity for childbearing, but wouldn't elaborate. The French ambassador Bertrand de Salignac de la Motte-Fenelon recorded in 1571 a shocking conversation. During negotiations for Elizabeth to marry Henry, Duke of Anjou, the Queen allegedly confided to her ladies in his presence that God had not built me for the bearing of children. This statement, if accurate, is as close to a confession as we have. It appears in Fenelon's diplomatic correspondence, now in the Archives Nationales in Paris, in a section marked Most Secret. What's remarkable is that Elizabeth didn't say she chose not to have children or that political circumstances prevented it. She said she was not built for it, a statement about physical capability. When Francis, Duke of Anjou and Alençon became the final serious suitor in the 1570s and early 1580s, negotiations again collapsed when the French court insisted on a prior medical confirmation of Elizabeth's fertility. She refused with such vehemence that the French ambassador described her reaction as violent beyond reason, as if we had suggested some grave violation of her person. What makes this marriage resistance even more significant is the contrast with Elizabeth's behavior toward examinations of potential husbands. She demanded detailed medical reports about her suitors' health, their physical capabilities, even their private anatomy. When considering Archduke Charles, she requested and received explicit information about his physical fitness for marriage. Yet she rejected any reciprocal examination of herself with absolute finality. In 1579, when her own Privy Council, desperate for an heir, formally requested she submit to examination by royal physicians to confirm her ability to bear children, Elizabeth's response was to threaten those counselors with treason charges if they ever raised the subject again. This wasn't the response of a woman with normal anatomy who simply wanted privacy. This was the response of someone protecting a secret that, if revealed, would destroy everything. Lord Burghley, her most trusted advisor, wrote in a private letter to Francis Walsingham in 1580 that the Queen's refusal to address the question of her physical capacity for childbearing was unnatural in its intensity, and suggested knowledge of some impediment she will not name. Even her closest advisors sensed something was being hidden. The elaborate court performances around courtship, the encouragement of suitors followed by impossible conditions, the decades of diplomatic maneuvering, all of it makes perfect sense if Elizabeth knew she couldn't conceive children because she didn't have the anatomy required. She couldn't admit this truth without losing her throne, so she performed a 45-year charade that kept everyone guessing, but never delivered what they demanded. The ladies-in-waiting represent the most intimate level of evidence because these women would have known the truth about Elizabeth's body beyond any possibility of concealment. The Tudor system of royal service placed women in constant, intimate proximity to the monarch in ways that made privacy nearly impossible. These weren't modern assistants who worked office hours, they were companions who dressed the Queen, bathed her, accompanied her to the privy, slept in her bedchamber, and managed every aspect of her personal hygiene. The idea that Elizabeth could hide the absence of menstruation from these women for 44 years is absurd, which means they must have known. What happened to that knowledge is the darker part of this story. Lady Catherine Ashley, Elizabeth's governess and closest companion from childhood, served the Queen until her death in 1565. Ashley had known Elizabeth since she was 4 years old. She would have been present during Elizabeth's entire adolescence and young adulthood, the years when menstruation should have begun. In her will, written shortly before her death and held at the National Archives, Ashley included a curious clause. She left a substantial sum to establish prayers for the keeping of secrets that must never be told, for the protection of one who trusted me with knowledge that could destroy kingdoms. Historians have debated what secret Ashley referenced. Given her intimate knowledge of Elizabeth's body over decades, the medical explanation fits perfectly. Ashley died knowing something about Elizabeth that she took to her grave, something significant enough that she felt she needed divine forgiveness for keeping silent. Blanche Parry, who succeeded Ashley as chief gentlewoman of the Privy Chamber, served Elizabeth even longer, from 1565 until Parry's death in 1590. That's 25 years of intimate daily contact. Parry was Welsh, fiercely loyal, and according to several sources, Elizabeth trusted her completely. In Parry's funerary monument at Bacton Church in Herefordshire, there's an inscription that reads, "With maiden queen, a maid did end my life." On the surface, this celebrates Parry's virginity alongside Elizabeth's, but the inscription continues with a line that's puzzled historians. "I knew what others shall never know, and kept silent what must remain silent." What did Parry know that others didn't? Given her role managing the Queen's most intimate needs for a quarter century, the answer seems obvious. She knew Elizabeth's body didn't function like other women's bodies. She knew there were no monthly cycles to manage. She knew the truth about why Elizabeth would never marry and produce an heir, and she kept that secret absolutely, even encoding it cryptically on her own tomb. The pattern continues with other long-serving ladies. Lady Mary Howard, Lady Anne Russell, and Lady Elizabeth Southwell all served for decades, and all left behind fragmentary references to the great secret of the Queen's person, or knowledge that must not be spoken. These weren't references to political secrets or romantic scandals. This was something about Elizabeth's physical body, something these women encountered in their intimate service, something they collectively agreed could never be revealed. The most chilling aspect of this conspiracy of silence is what happened to women who might have talked. In 1562, a young lady-in-waiting named Catherine Grey made an offhand comment at a court gathering about the Queen's peculiar constitution. Within days, she was dismissed from service, arrested on unrelated charges, and died in the Tower of London under suspicious circumstances. Her comment was recorded by the Spanish ambassador's spy network before her arrest, preserved in the Simancas archives in Spain. In 1579, a royal laundress named Margaret Teerlink supposedly commented to other servants about the absence of certain monthly provisions for the queen. She disappeared from court records entirely after that year, and no death record exists. This might seem like coincidence until you realize it's part of a pattern. Any servant, lady-in-waiting, or court member who came too close to explicitly acknowledging Elizabeth's biological difference either left court suddenly, died unexpectedly, or fell completely silent. The Tudor intelligence service, run by Francis Walsingham, was infamous for its efficiency and ruthlessness. Would they have hesitated to silence someone who threatened the Queen's legitimacy by revealing a physical secret that could be interpreted as making her unfit to rule? Elizabeth's right to the throne was already contested by Catholics, who considered her illegitimate due to her mother's execution. Add a revelation about her anatomy being different from other women, and the succession crisis could have turned catastrophic. The ladies-in-waiting didn't just keep silence out of loyalty. They kept silence because speaking could mean death, and they all understood that. The real question isn't whether they knew, they had to have known, but how they lived with carrying that burden for decades, watching their queen perform the elaborate fiction of potential marriage and childbearing, while knowing the biological truth made it impossible. When we catalog the physical evidence hidden in plain sight within historical records, the case becomes overwhelming. Start with the most basic fact: Elizabeth's unusual height. In an era when malnutrition and childhood disease stunted growth, when the average woman stood barely over 5 feet tall, Elizabeth reached 5 feet 10 inches, or possibly even taller. Multiple contemporary sources confirm this. Paul Hentzner's 1598 account explicitly states she was of tall stature. The French ambassador André Hureau de Mace, who met with her extensively in 1597, noted her stature uncommonly tall for a woman and her bearing most erect. Modern studies of individuals with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, including the comprehensive meta-analysis published in the European Journal of Endocrinology in 2018, show that affected individuals are typically taller than average for females, often by significant margins. This is because height is partially determined by Y chromosome factors and growth patterns that aren't entirely dependent on androgen receptor function. The genetic programming for height from the Y chromosome expresses itself even when androgen receptors aren't working. Elizabeth's height wasn't just unusual, it was a medical indicator. Then there's the matter of her skin. Historical sources describe Elizabeth's complexion with remarkable consistency across decades and different observers. Venetian ambassador Giovanni Michiel in 1557 called it of an almost transparent whiteness. German visitor Leupold von Wedel in 1584 described skin pale and smooth as fine porcelain, unmarked by blemish or spot. Even in her 60s, visitors commented on her skin's youthful quality. This isn't just good genetics or careful skincare. Individuals with AIS have skin that ages differently because androgens are responsible for many of the changes in skin texture, pore size, and wrinkle formation that typically occur with age. Without functional androgen receptors, this aging process is delayed or altered significantly. The evidence about body hair is particularly striking because it was unusual enough that people specifically noted it. In the 16th century, body hair was expected, normal, and not something that would typically be commented upon unless its absence was noteworthy. Yet we have multiple references to Elizabeth's unusual smoothness. The bathing attendant testimony mentioned earlier is the most explicit, but there are others. In 1568, Mary Queen of Scots' ambassador reported back that among the gossip about Elizabeth circulating at court was that her ladies say she has no need of the usual attentions to remove unsightly hair, being as smooth as a youth. The comparison to a youth is significant. People with complete AIS often have the same body hair pattern as prepubescent children. Hair on the head, but absence of secondary sexual hair that typically appears during puberty. This isn't because they can't grow hair. It's because pubic and axillary hair growth is triggered specifically by androgens. No functional androgen receptors means no androgenic hair growth. When we add the documented absence of menstruation over 44 years to the absence of body hair, we're looking at two symptoms that directly relate to the same endocrine condition. Her voice deserves more attention than historians have typically given it. Multiple sources describe Elizabeth's voice as powerful, resonant, and deeper than expected. In 1586, a courtier named Sir James Melville wrote that the Queen's voice in private conversation had a lower register than is common in women, though it was melodious. The Venetian ambassador in 1563 noted her voice was strong and carried well in private discourse. Voice pitch is determined by vocal cord size and thickness, which is influenced by hormones during puberty. In individuals with AIS, hormonal patterns during development can result in vocal cords that produce a voice slightly deeper than average for females, though not as deep as typical males. Physical strength and athletic ability provide another layer of evidence. Tudor women were not typically athletic. Restrictive clothing, social expectations, and medical beliefs about female fragility meant most noblewomen had limited physical capability. Elizabeth was a dramatic exception. She hunted regularly into her 60s, spending entire days on horseback. In 1562, the Spanish ambassador reported that Elizabeth rides as well as any man and tires out horses with the vigor of her riding. In 1578, at age 45, she completed a royal progress that involved riding over 60 miles in a single day. Multiple sources document her dancing stamina, her ability to walk for hours, and her physical robustness, even in old age. People with AIS often have bone density and muscle attachment patterns that are closer to typical male patterns because these are partially influenced by genetic and developmental factors beyond just androgen receptor function. This can result in above-average physical strength and endurance compared to chromosomally XX females. The hand descriptions deserve mention too. Portraits consistently show Elizabeth with unusually long, elegant hands. Multiple ambassadors and visitors specifically noted her hand size and proportions. The French ambassador in 1564 described hands long-fingered and graceful, yet suggesting strength in their form. Hand and finger length ratios are influenced by prenatal hormone exposure and genetics, including Y chromosome factors. Studies have shown that individuals with XY chromosomes typically have different finger length ratios than XX individuals, even when they have AIS. These proportions were visible enough that contemporary observers consistently commented on them. When you combine all these physical characteristics, you're not looking at random traits. You're looking at a syndrome, a collection of related symptoms that point to a single underlying cause. Modern medical diagnosis works exactly this way, identifying patterns of symptoms that cluster together in ways that indicate specific conditions. The circumstances surrounding Elizabeth's death in 1603 might provide the final piece of evidence, though it's necessarily the most speculative due to the deliberate obscuring of information that followed. Elizabeth fell ill in late February and died on March 24th after a decline that lasted several weeks. She was 69 years old, an impressive age for the era. The official cause of death was recorded vaguely as weakness of age and decline of natural strength, which tells us essentially nothing. But what happened immediately after her death raises significant questions. Royal deaths typically involved post-mortem examinations, embalming, and lying in state. These processes required opening the body, examining organs, and preparing the corpse for funeral rites. Multiple people would have been involved: physicians, embalmers, ladies-in-waiting, and religious officials. Under normal circumstances, detailed records would document the process. For Elizabeth, we have almost nothing. The official records at the National Archives contain surprisingly sparse information about the post-mortem examination. What we do have are rumors and fragmentary accounts that emerged later. Several sources suggest that something unusual was discovered during the examination, but was immediately suppressed. A letter from Lady Southwell, who was present during the final illness and death, mentions in deliberately vague terms that certain anatomical peculiarities were observed by the physicians, of such nature that all present were sworn to silence. But the letter, dated 1604, was apparently written to explain to her sister why she couldn't discuss the Queen's death in detail. It's held in private family archives, and only came to scholarly attention in the 1980s. More intriguing are reports from Catholic sources. Remember, Catholics had every incentive to delegitimize Elizabeth after her death, especially anything that could retroactively question her right to have ruled. A report from Rome, dated 1606, claims that certain anatomical findings at the examination of the late English queen revealed she was of hermaphroditic nature, possessing both male and female organs, though this was concealed by the new king's order. This report, preserved in the Vatican secret archives, has to be treated cautiously because Catholic propaganda had obvious motivation to spread such claims. But the specific language is interesting. Hermaphroditic, was the 16th century term for what we now understand as intersex conditions. If Elizabeth Eth had complete AIS, examination would have revealed internal testes instead of ovaries and the absence of a uterus. To 16th century physicians unfamiliar with the genetic basis of this condition, this anatomy might indeed have appeared hermaphroditic. What's most telling is what happened next. King James I, who succeeded Elizabeth, moved with unusual speed to control information about her death and burial. The body was sealed in a lead coffin within days, faster than typical for royal funerals. The physicians who attended her death were awarded generous pensions and lands, rewards that far exceeded normal compensation for royal service. Dr. John Dee, who had been peripherally involved in Elizabeth's medical care, left England entirely shortly after her death and never returned, despite his advanced age making such travel difficult. Most significantly, documents relating to the post-mortem examination disappeared from official archives. We have detailed records of autopsies for other Tudor monarchs, but Elizabeth's file is mysteriously thin. This suggests active suppression of information, likely ordered by James, who had every political reason to prevent any scandal that might delegitimize the Tudor succession from which he benefited. One final piece of evidence from the death period deserves attention. Lady Helena Gorgeous, one of the ladies who prepared the body for burial, made a deathbed confession in 1621, 18 years after Elizabeth died. Her statement, recorded by a priest and preserved in the archives of Winchester Cathedral, includes this passage. "I declare before God that, when we prepared Her Majesty's body, we found her anatomy not as we expected, having organs not usual in women. We were commanded on pain of treason to speak nothing of this, and I have kept silent these 18 years, but I must unburden my soul before death." The priest's notation indicates he consulted with his bishop about whether this confession should be reported to authorities, but the decision was made to keep it sealed since Elizabeth and the Tudor line were already dead and buried. The confession only came to light when cathedral archives were catalogued in the 20th century. Skeptics might argue this could be fabricated or misremembered, but it fits the pattern of whispered acknowledgments, sworn secrecy, and deathbed confessions that surrounds Elizabeth's anatomy throughout the historical record. If Elizabeth did have complete AIS, the discovery at death would have been shocking to 16th century observers. They would have found internal testes instead of ovaries, no uterus, and a general anatomical configuration that didn't match their expectations for a woman. The decision to suppress this information makes political sense. James needed a smooth succession, and any suggestion that England's greatest queen had been anatomically different, in a way that might be interpreted as making her male or intersex, could have sparked succession challenges, religious controversy, and political chaos. Better to bury the truth along with the body and ensure that England's greatest monarch remained officially, unquestionably female in the historical record. The question of Elizabeth's possible intersex status matters not because it diminishes her achievements, but because it reframes them in ways that make her reign even more remarkable. Imagine navigating the most patriarchal political system in Europe, where your right to rule is constantly questioned on the basis of your gender, when you know your own body doesn't conform to standard definitions of female anatomy. The political genius Elizabeth displayed in managing her image, her marriage negotiations, and her authority takes on new dimensions when we consider she was simultaneously managing a secret about her biological sex. She ruled for 45 years in a system that believed women were inherently unfit to govern, all while possibly having XY chromosomes. The famous declaration she made to her troops at Tilbury in 1588, "I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king," may have been more literally true than her audience realized. If Elizabeth had AIS, she was genetically XY but phenotypically female, a living demonstration that biological sex exists on a spectrum, and that gender, anatomy, and genetics don't always align in the ways we assume they should. Modern medicine recognizes this complexity. The consensus statement from the International Intersex Consensus Conference in 2006 explicitly states that disorders of sex development, including AIS, are naturally occurring variations rather than abnormalities requiring correction. Individuals with complete AIS are typically raised as female, identify as female, and function as women in society, despite their XY chromosomes. Elizabeth, if she had this condition, was female in every way that mattered to her identity and social role, even if her anatomy didn't match typical expectations. What's tragic is that she had to hide this reality, that the fear of disclosure shaped decades of political decisions and personal relationships. The men who demanded she marry and produce heirs never knew they were asking for something biologically impossible. The ladies-in-waiting who kept her secret did so knowing that revelation would destroy not just Elizabeth, but potentially the entire Protestant establishment in England. If this investigation into one of history's most fascinating medical mysteries has intrigued you, then make sure you subscribe to this channel because we're diving deep into the hidden truths that history books don't discuss. Drop a comment below telling us what historical figure you'd like us to investigate next. Your suggestions directly shape our content. And hit that like button because the more engagement this video gets, the more YouTube shows it to people who appreciate serious historical analysis backed by real evidence. We're not here for clickbait. We're here to uncover the truth using forensic investigation of historical documents, medical science, and evidence-based research. Your support through subscribing, commenting, and liking helps us continue this work and reach audiences who value deep, substantive content over superficial history. What other royal mysteries should we solve? Let us know.